Although Ptolemaic tradition suggests that Cleopatra is likely to have married her brother soon after their father's death, their marriage is nowhere recorded. If it did occur, it's likely to have been a marriage in name only. The age gap was unfortunate. The 18-year-old Cleopatra was rather too old to remain unwed, while 10-year-old Ptolemy was a little too young to consummate a marriage. This left Cleopatra in an awkward position. She needed to start producing the children who would continue her dynastic line. Ptolemy, as king, should have been the dominant partner in the relationship. But he was a minor, ruling via a regency council, and for the first year and a half of their joint reign, Cleopatra became the effective monarch, while her brother was pushed into the background. This sidelining of her brother was a tactical mistake, as it left him vulnerable to a group of ambitious Alexandrian courtiers who used the young king to further their own political ambitions. By the time Ptolemy was old enough for a full married life, his relationship with Cleopatra had irretrievably broken down, and Egypt was on the brink of civil war. Egypt, usually so fertile, was suffering the effects of years of unreliable Nile floods. The crisis was severe enough to unite the royal couple, who recognized that at a time of national shortage, the volatile citizens of Alexandria must be their primary concern. And the cities started to fill with hungry peasants. Meanwhile, Rome was temporarily distracted from Egyptian affairs. In 54 BC, Julia, daughter of Julius Caesar and beloved wife of Pompey, had died, severing the personal link between the two men. The following year, the third member of the triumvirate, Crassus, perished in a disastrous campaign. A wave of unease rippled through the Mediterranean world. It was assumed, quite rightly, that the Parthians would now attempt to take Syria, and in 49 BC, Caesar and his army crossed the Rubicon, the official boundary between Italy and Cisalpine Gaul, and effectively declared war on Pompey and Rome. Soon after, Pompey's son arrived in Alexandria to beg for military aid on his father's behalf. His request could not be honourably refused. Egypt supplied wheat, soldiers, and warships. The decision to grant this aid was taken by Ptolemy, or his ministers, with Cleopatra's name recorded second. The people of Alexandria were angry and blamed Cleopatra for the whole affair. Her apparent eagerness to please the Romans reminded them too much of her father's reign. Cleopatra's growing unpopularity in Alexandria may in part explain why Ptolemy's advisers chose this time to act against her. In the summer of 49 BC, Cleopatra's name disappeared from all official documents. Ptolemy was erasing the memory of his sister and retrospectively claiming sole rule from the time of his father's death. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria and began raising the mercenary army that would allow her to reclaim her throne. The fact that Cleopatra managed to raise an effective army at a time when the Roman civil war was causing massive disruption across the Mediterranean confirms that outside Alexandria, she was considered a viable candidate for the Egyptian throne. In August 48 BC, armies loyal to Pompey and Caesar met at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompey's 47,000 men outnumbered Caesar's by 2-1. But he was the weaker general. His advisers were inexperienced. Caesar won the battle, but by no means inclined to give up the fight, Pompey fled to his old ally, Egypt. Confident of a warm welcome, he sailed to Pelusium and dropped anchor near the beach. Outside Pelusium, Ptolemy and his army were nervously awaiting Cleopatra's army, which was marching from the east. Messengers came to announce Pompey's arrival and to ask for an audience with the king. Panicking, a meeting of Ptolemy's most trusted advisers was called. It was argued that if Pompey were welcomed as a friend, Caesar would automatically become Egypt's enemy. But if Pompey was driven away, he would become Egypt's enemy, and Caesar would blame Ptolemy for allowing him to escape. Furthermore, it was likely that Pompey would support Cleopatra in her battle for the throne. he should be killed before he landed. After all, a dead man does not bite. 4 days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria. Despite Pompey's death, the Roman civil war was far from over, and Caesar far from secure. Nevertheless, he made an extended stay in hostile Alexandria, where, or so he tells us, he soon found himself stranded by adverse northerly winds. This curious decision is nowhere explained. Authors of a romantic disposition have suggested that Caesar lingered in Egypt because of his deep love for Cleopatra. But he had not yet met the queen, who was still camped with her army to the east of Pelusium. It seems instead that Caesar stayed for the most practical of reasons: to tax the wealthy Alexandrians. Settling in for a long visit and turning a blind eye to the local resentment, Caesar sent for reinforcements and spent his days writing his memoirs and sightseeing. Since Egypt was close to civil war, perhaps Caesar calculated that increased stability would bring increased wealth, which would allow increased taxation. Perhaps he understood that a grateful Egyptian monarch might be of use in the future. Maybe he was simply bored. Whatever his reasoning, Caesar decided to settle the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy, and ordered both to appear before him at Alexandria. Ptolemy did as he was bidden, leaving his troops under the command of Achillas. Superficially, Ptolemy held all the cards. He had both military support and that of the Alexandrians. He was here on the spot, and Caesar's easiest option was surely to award him the crown. But Cleopatra, too, had something to offer. She was older and more experienced, while 13-year-old Ptolemy was controlled by a clique of advisers. She had an impressive track record of loyalty to Rome. If Caesar was hoping to recover Egyptian debts to Rome, Cleopatra might be of help. But she would not necessarily want to plead this argument in public. A preliminary private meeting with Caesar would better suit her needs. So she too set off for Alexandria. With Achillas and his army blocking her route through Pelusium, and Pothinus guarding the harbour at Alexandria, hers was a secret, undignified journey. Abandoning her troops, she slipped past Achillas and travelled in a small boat along the coast. She landed in the palaces district at nightfall. The story of how Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace by the Sicilian merchant Apollodorus, who hid her in a bedroll or a bundle of linen sheets, has grown in the telling, so that in modern versions of her tale we find Cleopatra being unrolled from an exotic, anachronistic Persian rug to tumble alluringly dishevelled and breathless at Caesar's feet. This story does not hold up to detailed scrutiny, and it stems in its entirety from the fluent pen of Plutarch. Was this truly the only means by which Cleopatra could make her way into Caesar's presence? Having gained the security of the palace, could she not have abandoned her bedroll to make a more conventional entry? It's hard to imagine that Caesar would allow an unknown Sicilian to bring a package into his suite without having it searched. Was Caesar then expecting Cleopatra's arrival? The Roman senator Cassius Dio tells us that they had already been in correspondence. Or did Cleopatra deliberately plan to arrive as the ultimate gift-wrapped package in a carefully stage-managed production designed to appeal to Caesar's notoriously susceptible nature? It would certainly be naive to assume that Cleopatra, who shared the Ptolemaic love of elaborate spectacle, was unaware of the impact of her unorthodox arrival. What did Caesar see when Apollodorus dropped his bundle and revealed his queen? If we're imagining the scene as described by Plutarch, we should probably indulge our wildest fantasies and picture a dark room, flickering torchlight, high stone walls, gilded furniture, a mosaic floor, and a dark-haired, olive-skinned young woman dressed in Greek rather than Egyptian garments. Cleopatra is likely to have been short by modern standards, and probably, like almost everyone of her time, suffered from bad teeth. Her coins, unflattering to modern eyes, suggest a prominent nose and chin and a rather thick neck. It's hard to be more precise, as we have no real idea what Cleopatra looked like. No contemporary descriptions and few contemporary illustrations have survived. And what did Cleopatra see when she tumbled from her bedding roll to lie at Caesar's feet? A man 30 years older than herself, well-built, tall by Roman standards, with dark eyes, a pale rounded face, receding fair hair and a bad comb-over. Caesar was notoriously self-conscious about his baldness and insisted that his statues be topped with youthful mops of curly hair. He liked to be well-groomed, and his clothes were the height of fashion. Suetonius mentions wrist-length sleeves, with fringes on his striped senatorial robe, and a daringly loose belt. Clearly, Caesar appreciated luxury, but he was no hedonist. Unusually for a Roman, he drank sparingly, and he ate anything that was put in front of him. Caesar was the ultimate celebrity of his age, known throughout the civilized world. Cleopatra would have understood that she was facing a man with exceptional drive and ambition, an excellent politician, orator and author, a superb horseman and extremely successful general. Caesar was known to be both good-humoured and amusing. Caesar and Cleopatra had much in common. Both were ruthlessly ambitious and prepared to take prodigious risks to achieve their ambitions. Both had a vested interest in ensuring that Egypt did not succumb to civil war. Both had the knack of persuading the ordinary people to love them, yet both were to a certain extent lonely and insecure. Caesar had lost his only daughter and suffered from terrible nightmares. Cleopatra, estranged from her younger siblings, had lost her mother, 2 sisters, and the father who had taught her that only Rome could protect the Ptolemaic dynasty and that Romans could be bought. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra needed Rome's protection. So who seduced whom? If Cleopatra planned her unorthodox entrance to entice Caesar, we should probably accept that she planned to seduce him. For a queen needing both an ally and a son, this would have been a sensible diplomatic move. But this seemingly wanton behaviour has stigmatized Cleopatra as little more than a high-class whore. Ptolemy went to bed that night a happy lad, secure in the knowledge that his sister, trapped at Pelusium, would be unable to plead her case before Caesar. He woke up the next morning to find that she had somehow arrived at the palace. She was already on the most intimate of terms with Caesar and had managed to persuade him to support her cause. It was all too much for a 13-year-old boy to bear. Rushing from the palace, he ripped off his diadem and the crowd surged forward, intent on mobbing the palace. But Caesar would not be intimidated. Before a formal assembly, he made it very clear that he expected the brother and sister to rule Egypt together.